June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The morning sun climbs over an ocean that stretches endless in every direction, its surface rippling like hammered steel under a sky bleached white by tropical heat. 15 American aircraft carriers slice through the Pacific swells in perfect formation, their bows carving white foam that trails behind them like bridal veils. On the flight deck of the USS Lexington, the air shimmers with fuel vapors and exhaust. Engines roar to life. The deck crews, their khaki uniforms already dark with sweat, move between the aircraft with practiced choreography. One by one, Grumman F6F Hellcats thunder down the wooden deck and leap into the crystalline air. Within 30 minutes, nearly 500 American fighters will be airborne, their wings glinting like schools of silver fish against the blue. From the northwest, another armada approaches. 9 Japanese carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea among them, launch their own strike force. Their pilots have trained for months, preparing for this decisive battle that will determine the fate of the Mariana Islands. They climb through the same tropical air with the confidence of warriors who have ruled these skies since the war began. They believe they are flying toward victory. They have no idea they are flying toward a slaughter that will be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By sunset, the outcome will be recorded in numbers that stagger comprehension. 476 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 3 carriers sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm, once the most feared naval aviation force on Earth, will cease to exist as an effective fighting force. Against this devastation, the Americans will lose 123 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents during a night recovery. The technological and numerical superiority is so overwhelming that American pilots will describe the engagement not as combat, but as target practice. The battle does not mark a turning point in the Pacific War. It marks something far more definitive. It marks the moment when Japan's military leadership confronted an inescapable truth they had feared since December 1941. They were not fighting a nation. They were fighting an industrial colossus that could not be defeated, could not be outlasted, and could not be reasoned with. The carriers that sailed across the Philippine Sea that morning represented something unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. They were not merely ships. They were mobile factories of air power, each one capable of projecting more striking power than entire air forces of previous wars. They were floating cities equipped with hospitals, machine shops, bakeries, and facilities that could repair battle damage that would have sent conventional warships home for months. Most significantly, they were numerous beyond anything the world had seen. While Japan struggled to keep even 6 or 7 carriers operational at any given moment, the United States had launched a production program so vast it defied rational military calculation. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards commissioned 32 fleet carriers of the Essex-class alone, massive 30,000-ton warships, each nearly 900 feet long, capable of carrying up to 100 aircraft. 14 of these giants entered service before the war's end. They were joined by dozens of light carriers built on cruiser hulls, and by escort carriers constructed with such speed and in such quantities that they were referred to as Kaiser's coffins, after industrialist Henry Kaiser, whose shipyards could complete one every week. The Casablanca-class escort carriers alone numbered 50 ships. By the war's end, the United States Navy possessed more aircraft carriers than every other nation on Earth combined had built in all of human history. The symbolic heart of this industrial tsunami was not any particular ship, but what they contained: the arresting cable. That single strand of woven steel stretched across the carrier deck and connected to massive hydraulic brakes hidden below represented everything that separated American naval power from Japanese desperation. Every carrier possessed multiple cables. They had to be replaced regularly, worn down by the violent impact of arrested landings. American carriers received replacement cables as routine supply items, delivered by fleet oilers and supply ships that moved across the Pacific in endless procession. Japanese carriers, by contrast, hoarded their cables, patched them, spliced them, because their supply chains had been severed by American submarines. The cables were small things, mundane pieces of equipment, but they became symbols of a larger reality. American abundance against Japanese scarcity. American logistics against Japanese improvisation. American mass production against Japanese handcraft. This disparity had not always been so apparent. In December 1941, when Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 aircraft carriers. The United States Pacific Fleet had 3. Japan's carrier pilots were among the most experienced and skilled aviators in the world, veterans of years of combat over China. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi Zero, were technological marvels, fast, maneuverable, with a combat radius that astounded Western observers. Japan's naval leadership had spent 2 decades developing carrier doctrine, perfecting the tactics of massed carrier strikes that had proven so devastating at Pearl Harbor. By any reasonable assessment, Japan entered the Pacific War with not just parity in carrier warfare, but clear superiority. What the Japanese Navy possessed in quality, they believed they could leverage into victory before American industrial power could mobilize. This was the core assumption underlying Japan's entire war strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively through American industrial centers. While the quote attributed to him about awakening a sleeping giant may be Hollywood invention, his actual words from correspondence and war diaries reveal a man who comprehended the terrible mathematics of industrial war. In the first 6 to 12 months, he predicted, Japan could run wild and win victory upon victory. After that, he had no expectation of success. The first 6 months vindicated his optimism. Japanese carriers ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans with seeming impunity. They struck at Darwin, Australia. They raided Ceylon. They sank the British carriers Hermes and the battleship Prince of Wales. In the Coral Sea in May 1942, they damaged USS Lexington badly enough to force her scuttling. At every turn, Japanese carrier aviation demonstrated its technical proficiency and tactical excellence. But even in these early victories, careful observers could detect the fault lines that would eventually fracture Japan's war effort. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japan possessed damage carriers that required months of repair work. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where the Americans sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day, Japan's carrier strength was halved. The ships could be replaced, given time and resources. The pilots could not. Japan's naval aviation training program was rigorous but small, designed to produce a limited number of elite aviators rather than a continuous stream of competent pilots. The men who went down with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway represented years of institutional knowledge, thousands of hours of flight experience, and operational expertise that could not be replicated in training schools. When they died, Japanese naval aviation lost not just pilots, but an irreplaceable generation of combat leaders. The Americans, conversely, rotated their experienced pilots back to the United States to serve as instructors, deliberately spreading their combat knowledge across an expanding training infrastructure. By 1943, American naval aviation training facilities were graduating thousands of pilots annually. These new aviators might lack the 1,000-hour veteran's polish, but they flew aircraft that compensated for inexperience with technological advantages. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, which entered service in 1943, was specifically designed to counter the Zero. It was heavier, less maneuverable, but faster in a dive, more heavily armed, and, critically, far more survivable. The Hellcat had armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement that allowed it to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero. The Zero had been designed with offensive power prioritized over pilot protection, a design philosophy that reflected the Bushido influence belief that a warrior's skill and spirit mattered more than defensive precautions. The Hellcat's design philosophy reflected American industrial abundance. Build aircraft so numerous and so survivable that losing individual planes and pilots did not matter strategically. This divergence in design philosophy extended to every aspect of carrier operations. American carriers possessed radar systems that could detect incoming aircraft at distances exceeding 100 miles, giving defending fighters time to climb to advantageous altitude and position. Japanese carriers, with few exceptions, lacked effective radar. American carriers had sophisticated combat information centers where radar data was compiled, analyzed, and used to vector defending fighters with radio guidance. Japanese carriers relied on visual sighting and limited radio coordination. American carriers operated with massive support fleets, oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, food transports, that enabled them to remain at sea for months. Japanese carriers increasingly operated tethered to land bases, their mobility constrained by fuel shortages and ammunition scarcity. By mid-1943, these accumulated advantages began manifesting in combat results that seemed to defy natural law. In engagement after engagement, American carrier aircraft dominated their Japanese counterparts with casualty ratios that suggested not combat between comparable forces, but hunting. The transformation was not merely technological. It was psychological. Japanese pilots, raised in a military culture that emphasized fighting spirit and warrior ethos, found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to care nothing for individual heroism. The Americans attacked in formations of overwhelming size, with pre-planned tactics executed with mechanical precision. Japanese pilots who survived these engagements reported not fighting warriors, but fighting a machine, something impersonal, numerous, beyond comprehension, and utterly indifferent to Japanese courage. This mechanical quality reached its apotheosis at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese plan for the engagement, Operation Ego, was tactically sound. Japanese carriers would launch their strike aircraft at maximum range, benefiting from land-based air support from the Marianas. The Americans would be caught between carrier aircraft and land-based bombers, forced to divide their defensive efforts. Japanese naval aviation would achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them since Midway, destroy enough American carriers to regain the initiative, and force the Americans to the negotiating table. On paper, the plan had merit. In execution, it encountered American naval power at its fully realized industrial zenith. The American task force that awaited the Japanese strike contained 15 fleet and light carriers. Those carriers operated more than 800 aircraft. Supporting them were 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The entire formation moved with its own supply fleet, an armada of tankers and ammunition ships that enabled sustained operations. When Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported the American formation size, the reports were initially dismissed as exaggeration. No rational military assessment suggested the Americans could have assembled such a force less than 3 years after Pearl Harbor. But the reports were accurate. America's shipyards had not merely rebuilt the Pacific Fleet. They had created something qualitatively different, a mobile air force of such magnitude that it could simultaneously defend itself, attack enemy carriers, and conduct sustained strikes against land targets. The Japanese strike waves that approached the American formation on the morning of June 19 flew into what aviators would later describe as the most sophisticated air defense system yet devised. Radar detected them more than 140 miles out. American fighters climbed to 30,000 feet, guided by radio vectors to positions of tactical advantage. As the Japanese formations approached, they encountered not chaotic dogfighting, but coordinated defensive doctrine. American fighters dove from above in successive waves, breaking Japanese formations before they could begin attack runs. Those Japanese aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen encountered anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented density, not just from the carriers, but from every ship in the formation, all linked by radio, all firing under centralized direction. The destruction was methodical. The first Japanese strike wave lost 42 aircraft before a single bomb fell near an American ship. The second wave lost 98. The third wave, already scattered by fighter attacks, jettisoned bombs and fled. The fourth wave became disoriented, couldn't locate the American carriers, and circled until it ran low on fuel. As they turned back toward their own carriers, American fighters hunted them across the Philippine Sea's empty sky. Of approximately 373 aircraft Japan launched that day, 315 did not return. Many pilots never saw the American carriers. They were shot down during approach, during defensive maneuvering, or while fleeing. They died without accomplishing anything, without even understanding what had killed them. For the American pilots, the engagement became monotonous. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Alex Ratio, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, describing the experience as like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The phrase caught on. Within days, the battle was universally known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a nickname that captured both the one-sided nature of the combat and the casual, almost sporting attitude of the victors. The Japanese, who had expected a decisive naval battle, had instead been systematically exterminated by a defensive system so comprehensive it functioned almost autonomously. While Japanese pilots died over the Philippine Sea, American submarines stalked the Japanese carrier force. USS Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho, newest and most advanced in the Japanese fleet. A single torpedo hit, but damage control errors led to gasoline vapor accumulation from ruptured fuel tanks. Hours later, an electrical spark triggered an explosion so massive it broke the carrier's back. She sank, taking 1,650 men with her. USS Kavala torpedoed Shokaku, Pearl Harbor veteran, hitting her with 3 torpedoes. Shokaku's damage control crews fought the resulting fires for 3 hours before a catastrophic explosion sent her to the bottom. In a single day, Japan lost 3 carriers, more than 400 aircraft, and most of 2 complete air groups. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, as an instrument of offensive naval warfare, ceased to exist. The implications of this destruction transcended military calculations. For the Japanese leadership, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the final collapse of the strategic assumptions underlying their entire war effort. They had gambled that American will would break before American industry fully mobilized, that a few sharp defeats would convince the United States to negotiate a compromise peace. The Philippine Sea demonstrated that American industry had not just mobilized, it had created military capability on a scale that rendered Japanese strategy obsolete. Every Japanese carrier sunk was being replaced by 5 American carriers. Every Japanese pilot killed was being replaced by 10 American pilots. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed was being replaced by 100 American aircraft. These were not metaphorical comparisons. They were literal production statistics. In 1943 alone, American shipyards commissioned 15 Essex-class fleet carriers. That same year, Japan commissioned 2. In 1944, America commissioned 8 more Essex-class carriers, 7 light carriers, and 33 escort carriers. Japan commissioned 4 light carriers. The disparity extended beyond numbers to capability. American carriers were larger, faster, carried more aircraft, had better damage control systems, and operated with support infrastructure that Japanese carriers could only imagine. An Essex-class carrier damaged in combat could expect repair by a mobile service squadron within days, often while remaining at sea. A damaged Japanese carrier had to return to Japan itself for repair, a journey that exposed it to submarine attack and removed it from operations for months. The arresting cable, that symbolic strand of steel, came to represent this disparity in microcosm. American carriers used and replaced cables as routine consumables. Japanese carriers guarded their cables like precious artifacts because replacement cables weren't coming. Japanese supply ships were being sunk by American submarines faster than they could be built. Japanese industrial capacity was being diverted to replacing merchant tonnage rather than producing military equipment. By late 1944, Japan's carrier pilots were receiving abbreviated training because fuel shortages limited flight hours. They were going into combat with 100 hours of flight time, while their American opponents had 400. They were flying aircraft inferior to American designs because Japanese industry lacked the aluminum, the electronics, and the precision manufacturing capacity to build comparable machines. This material disparity manifested in ways both large and small. American carrier crews ate regular meals of steak, eggs, fresh vegetables, and ice cream. Aircraft carriers had ice cream machines. Japanese carrier crews subsisted on rice, dried fish, and whatever could be scrounged from local sources. American carriers had dentists, optometrists, and medical facilities capable of surgery. Japanese carriers had basic medical supplies and hope for the best. American carriers had recreation spaces, libraries, and postal services that delivered letters from home with remarkable regularity. Japanese carriers had exhausted men working 20-hour shifts because crew sizes had been reduced to conserve manpower. The accumulation of these small differences created a psychological gulf. American sailors understood they were part of an industrial machine that valued their lives, their health, and their welfare. Japanese sailors understood they were expendable resources in a war their nation was losing. By October 1944, when the American invasion of the Philippines began, Japanese naval leadership confronted strategic bankruptcy. They possessed carriers, but no trained pilots to fly from them. They possessed battleships, but insufficient fuel to operate them. They possessed strategic objectives, but no operational means to achieve them. In desperation, they conceived Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. A plan of such transparent desperation, it revealed how completely American industrial power had broken Japanese strategic thinking. Japanese carriers would sortie as decoys, deliberately exposing themselves to lure the American carrier force away from the landing beaches. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships would slip through undefended straits and destroy the American amphibious fleet. The plan succeeded in its decoy mission. American carriers did pursue the Japanese carrier force, but failed in its objective. American battleships and escort carriers stopped the Japanese battleship force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese carriers used as bait were systematically destroyed. For carriers were sunk in a battle where they barely defended themselves because they had almost no aircraft to launch. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a coherent fighting force. What followed was not naval warfare, but systematic destruction. American carriers roamed the Western Pacific with near impunity, striking targets in the Philippines, Taiwan, Okinawa, and eventually Japan itself. Japanese response evolved from conventional defense to kamikaze attacks. Suicide strikes born not from religious fanaticism, but from mathematical desperation. Japan possessed limited fuel, limited aircraft, and limited pilots. Conventional attacks achieved almost nothing against American defensive capability. Suicide attacks at least guaranteed that each sortie resulted in some damage, assuming the kamikaze penetrated the defensive screen. Between October 1944 and August 1945, kamikaze aircraft sank dozens of American ships, mostly smaller vessels, destroyers, destroyer escorts, landing ships. They damaged many more, including several fleet carriers. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs in March 1945, triggering fires and explosions that killed more than 800 men. She survived, limped back to the United States, and was repaired. USS Intrepid was hit by 5 kamikazes during her wartime service. She survived each one, was repaired, and returned to action. Japanese submarines called her the ghost ship, a vessel that refused to die. The nickname was intended to convey menace. Instead, it captured American industrial reality. Ships could be repaired, damaged carriers could be replaced, losses could be absorbed, because American shipyards were producing faster than Japanese forces could sink. The statistics defy comprehension in their magnitude. During World War II, American shipyards launched more than 2,700 naval vessels, including 141 aircraft carriers of all types. American factories produced more than 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. American industrial output in 1944 exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. By 1945, the United States was producing more than half of all manufactured goods on Earth. This was not military production in any traditional sense. This was continental-scale industrial mobilization, the transformation of an entire economy into a military supply system. The Japanese leadership had known this was possible. They had studied American industrial capacity before the war. They had visited American factories, read American production statistics, and understood the theoretical potential. What they had failed to grasp was the speed of transformation. They had calculated that mobilization would require years, giving Japan time to consolidate its conquests and create a defensive perimeter too costly to breach. Instead, American industry mobilized in months. Factories that built automobiles in 1940 were building bombers in 1941. Shipyards that built merchant vessels in 1939 were building carriers in 1942. The transformation was not gradual. It was convulsive, a wholesale restructuring of economic activity unprecedented in peacetime mobilization. The carriers that filled the Pacific by 1945 were physical manifestations of this mobilization. Each one represented thousands of workers, millions of hours of labor, entire supply chains redirected to single purposes. An Essex-class carrier required more than 4 million man-hours to construct. Its steel came from Pittsburgh. Its electronics came from Massachusetts. Its aircraft came from factories in New York, Connecticut, and California. The fuel oil that powered its engines came from Texas. The food that fed its crew came from farms across the Midwest. Building one carrier required coordinating hundreds of suppliers across an entire continent. Building 32 required industrial organization on a scale only the United States possessed the infrastructure to achieve. This infrastructure did not materialize spontaneously. It existed before the war, built during decades of peacetime economic expansion. America's vast railroad network could move materials and finished products from coast to coast. America's electrical grid could power factory complexes that ran 24 hours daily. America's educational system produced engineers and skilled workers in quantities unmatched by any other nation. Most critically, America's geographic isolation meant this infrastructure remained untouched by war. Japanese factories were being bombed. German factories were being bombed. American factories ran 3 shifts daily without interruption, producing at maximum capacity for years on end. The carriers represented something beyond industrial capacity. They represented a political and social system that could mobilize that capacity without coercion. American workers built those carriers for wages, not forced labor. American factories converted production voluntarily, incentivized by government contracts, not threatened with nationalization. American innovation accelerated during the war as companies competed for those contracts, developing new construction methods, new materials, and new techniques. The Kaiser shipyards, which revolutionized escort carrier construction, were private enterprises. The Grumman factory, which designed and built the Hellcat, was a private company. The system that produced military supremacy was not centralized command economy, but market capitalism adapted to wartime urgency. This distinction manifested in unexpected ways. American carriers had ice cream machines because American sailors expected ice cream. The machines served no military purpose. They consumed electrical power, required maintenance, and took up space. But they existed because American military leadership understood that morale mattered, that men fought better when reminded of home, that small luxuries sustained motivation during long deployments. Japanese carriers had no such amenities because Japanese military culture emphasized austerity and self-sacrifice. The difference seems trivial, but multiply that difference across thousands of small decisions: better food, better medical care, better rest facilities, better mail service, and it accumulated into profound disparity in combat effectiveness. By the spring of 1945, American carriers operated off the Japanese coast with an arrogance born from complete control. They struck Tokyo itself, their aircraft flying over the Imperial Palace with impunity. They destroyed what remained of the Japanese Navy in harbor. They sank merchant shipping until Japan's island economy began to strangle. In July 1945, The battleship HMS King George V joined the American carrier force, representing British participation in the final campaign. A British liaison officer observing American carrier operations filed a report that captured the essential nature of the force he was witnessing. The Americans do not conduct naval operations. They conduct industrial operations at sea. The phrase was meant as military analysis. It became epitaph. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the ceremony occurred on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, but the surrender was dictated by the carriers that surrounded her. Those carriers represented a form of power that Japan's warrior culture had failed to comprehend. It was not martial power, not the strength of individual warriors or the courage of particular units. It was systemic power, the capacity of an entire society to transform itself into an instrument of war. Japan had fought America, but America had buried Japan under the accumulated output of continental-scale industrial production, a tide of material so vast it rendered Japanese strategy, Japanese courage, and Japanese sacrifice equally irrelevant. The arresting cables on those carrier decks, stretched across wooden planks scarred by thousands of landings, had witnessed the war's transformation. In 1942, they caught aircraft flown by pilots still learning their craft, flying aircraft that were good but not dominant, executing operations carefully planned because resources were scarce. By 1945, those cables or their replacements, because the originals had been worn out and discarded, caught aircraft flown by pilots who had never known defeat, flying aircraft technologically superior to anything the Japanese possessed, executing operations of routine efficiency because resources were effectively infinite. The cables themselves were unchanged. The system they served had become something unprecedented in human history. Military force generated not by strategic genius or tactical innovation, but by industrial production operating at a scale that transformed quantity into a quality all its own. In the end, the Pacific War's outcome was never in doubt once American industry fully mobilized. Every carrier launched was a declaration of inevitable victory. Every aircraft produced was another coffin nail. Every arresting cable replaced was confirmation of a system that could not be defeated because it could not be exhausted. Japanese pilots who dove their aircraft into American ships in final kamikaze attacks were not fighting warriors. They were fighting factory production schedules, supply chain logistics, and industrial capacity measured in millions of tons of steel. No amount of courage could prevail against mathematics of that magnitude. The carriers that filled Tokyo Bay in September 1945, hosting the surrender ceremony and the beginning of occupation, represented the answer to a question Japan's leadership had never wanted to ask. What happens when a modern industrial democracy decides to apply its complete economic capacity to military purposes? The answer was visible in the forest of carrier masts that crowded the harbor, in the uninterrupted procession of American aircraft overhead, in the supply ships and transport ships and hospital ships and repair ships that extended to the horizon. The answer was simple, mathematical, and absolute. You lose. Not because your warriors were less brave, not because your strategy was flawed, not because your leaders made mistakes. You lose because the other side can build 5 ships for every one you build, train 10 pilots for every one you train, replace every loss while you cannot replace any loss, and continue doing so for years while your economy starves and your industry crumbles and your cities burn. This was the truth that American carriers brought to the Pacific. Not that democracy was morally superior, though it was. Not that freedom was worth fighting for, though it was. The truth they brought was older and simpler. Industrial capacity, properly mobilized, generates military power that cannot be overcome by any other factor. The carriers were not symbols. They were proof. Floating proof, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean, that modern war is won in factories before it is won on battlefields, and that any nation choosing to fight America would first have to outproduce an industrial system built across an entire continent, immune to attack, and capable of production at scales that defy human intuition. The arresting cables are long since gone, the carriers that once carried them mostly scrapped, their steel recycled into the peaceful commerce of later decades. But the lesson they taught remains, written in the statistics of production, in the casualty ratios of battles, in the simple mathematics of industrial war. Some nations build warriors. America built factories. And in the crucible of the Pacific War, the factories proved decisive.